One of the most interesting things about being alive is that we're the kind of creatures who can sit around and wonder what it even means to not be alive anymore. Think about that for a second. Here we are, collections of atoms arranged in just the right way to ask questions about our own existence. Atoms stop cooperating in quite the same way, and we call that death. But what action then? Where does the you go? Or does it go anywhere at all? But does it go anywhere at all? Now, people have come up with all sorts of answers, religious, philosophical, scientific, and each one tells a different story. But instead of jumping to conclusions, I'd like to do something a little more fun, a little more honest too. Let's take this question apart the way a curious mind should. Let's look at what we really know, what we think we know, and most importantly, what we're still completely puzzled about. The truth is, the mystery of death isn't just about the end of life. It's about understanding what life is in the first place. One of the most interesting things about being alive is that we are the kind of creatures who can sit around and wonder what it even means to not be alive anymore. Think about that for a second. Here we are, collections of atoms, arranged in just the right way to ask questions about our own existence. Not just to live, not just to react, but to pause and ask, what is this? What am I doing here? What happens when all of this stops? That's a very strange thing when you look at it from the outside. The universe, through us, has become curious about itself. Now, when we talk about death, people often imagine it as some kind of event like switching off a light. One moment you're here thinking, feeling, remembering, and the next moment, nothing. But even that idea raises questions. What do we really mean by nothing? Is it something we can understand, or are we trying to describe something that by its very nature we can never experience? A scientific point of view, what we can say is this: your body is a highly organized system. Your brain, especially, is an incredibly complex network of electrical and chemical signals. Memories, emotions, all of these are patterns of activity happening inside that system. When the body stops functioning, those processes gradually shut down. The heart stops pumping. The brain no longer maintains its activity, and the patterns that we associate with you are no longer sustained. But that just shifts the question, doesn't it? Because if you are those patterns, then what does it mean for them to disappear? Is it like a story that ends? More like a process that simply ceases without any awareness of its own ending. And here's where things get even more interesting. People try to imagine being dead. They often picture darkness, silence, emptiness. But that's actually not quite right. Darkness is something you see. Silence is something you hear. Ambience is something you feel or perceive. All of those require a functioning mind. Without that, there isn't even the experience of nothing, because there's no one there to experience it. Silence is not just what happens after death, but what is it that allows us to experience anything at all while we're alive? You see, we were very good at telling stories to fill in the gaps of what we don't know. Throughout history, people have imagined afterlives, souls leaving the body, or consciousness continuing in some other form. It can be comforting or meaningful or deeply tied to culture and belief. And from a purely curious standpoint, the kind of curiosity that drives science, we have to be careful. What we can observe from what we can observe from what we simply hope or assume. And what we can observe is this: everything we associate with being a person, your memories, your personality, your awareness, depends on the physical processes happening in your brain. To change those processes, and you change the experience, stop them entirely, and the experience, as far as we can tell, doesn't continue. That doesn't make the question any less fascinating. In fact, it makes it more so. We're not just asking about that. We're asking about consciousness itself. What is this thing that allows a bunch of atoms to feel like something from the inside? I become aware. And maybe the most honest answer we can give right now is we don't fully know. We have pieces of the puzzle. We understand parts of the mechanism. Teacher, how subjective experience arises and what its limits really are is still something we're exploring, still something we're trying to figure out, still something we're trying to figure out, still something that keeps scientists and curious minds awake at night, wondering how something as ordinary as being alive can also be so deeply mysterious and so completely unexplained when you look closely enough at it and realize that even the question is part of the mystery itself. Now, people have come up with all sorts of answers to the question of what happens when you die, religious ones, philosophical ones, active ones, and each of them tries in its own way to make sense of something that we can directly observe. If you look at even religious explanations, they often describe death as a transition rather than an ending. Essential part of you, a soul, a spirit, something non-physical, continues on in another form or another place. Islam cultures have imagined this in different ways. Heavens, hells, cycles of rebirth, or entirely different realms of existence. And what's interesting is not just the variety of these ideas, but the fact that they exist at all. Because time and geography seem to have a strong tendency to believe that death is not the final chapter. Now, from a curious perspective, you might ask, where do these ideas come from? Based on evidence, or are they attempts to answer a very uncomfortable question? Because if we're being honest, the idea that everything simply stops is not an easy one to accept. The mind resists it. It looks for continuity, for meaning, for some kind of extension beyond the boundary of life. Whereas, on the other hand, often approach the question differently. Instead of focusing on what happens after death, they ask what it means to exist in the first place. Argue that death is nothing to fear, because when it happens, there is no subject left to experience. And yet, others suggest that the fear of death comes not from the state of being dead, but from the awareness that life is limited. And that awareness shapes how we think, how we act, and how we value our time. That's the scientific approach, which is a bit more cautious. Science doesn't like to make claims without evidence. And the saying what definitely happens after death, it focuses on what can be measured and tested. And what we observe is that consciousness appears to depend on the brain. When the brain is active, there is experience. When it is altered through injury, chemicals, or disease, experience changes. When it stops functioning, not entirely, the experience as far as we can detect stops as well. But notice something important here. Science is not saying we have proven that nothing happens after death. That's what it's really saying is we don't have evidence that anything continues. And those two statements are not exactly the same. On which the other is an honest admission of limits. And this is where things get really interesting because it shows us something about the nature of knowledge itself. We have with some we can answer by looking, measuring, experimenting. And then there are questions that might be beyond our current ability to test, or maybe even beyond what can be tested at all. Which what happens when you die? We're not just asking about death. We're also asking about the boundaries of human understanding. To deal with questions where evidence runs out. Do we fill the gap with belief, with speculation, or do we simply say we don't know? Very honest, almost refreshing about that last option, to admit uncertainty, to be comfortable not having a complete answer, to keep the question open rather than closing it too quickly. The moment you say this is definitely what happens without evidence, you stop exploring, you stop being curious. And curiosity, after all, is what got us asking the question in the first place. So instead of choosing one answer and holding on to it tightly, it might be more interesting to examine why we're drawn to certain answers over others, why some explanations feel more satisfying, or more comforting, or more believable, and what that tells us about the way our minds work when faced with one of the deepest and most unsettling mysteries we can think about. Or ignore this question apart the way a curious mind should, not by jumping straight to answers, but by slowing down and examining the pieces one by one as carefully as we can. Because sometimes the most interesting part of a question isn't the answer, it's how the question is built in the first place. What happens when you die? We're actually combining several different questions into one. There's the biological question. What happens to the body? A big psychological question. What happens to the mind, to thoughts and memories? And maybe there is the deeper, more abstract question. What happens to the sense of being, that feeling that there is something it is like to be you? With the body, the answer is, in many ways, the simplest. The human body is a system made up of smaller systems, organs, tissues, cells, all working together to maintain a kind of balance. The ants can no longer be sustained. The system begins to break down. That is no longer delivered to cells, and the processes that keep everything running gradually come to a halt. Practical perspective, nothing mysterious is happening. The same laws of chemistry that govern the body during life continue to apply after death. Things become less straightforward. What we call the mind is not a single thing you can point to, not a separate object sitting somewhere inside the brain. Instead, it seems to be an activity, a process, something that happens when the brain is functioning in a certain way. Emotions, memories, these are not static objects, but patterns that are constantly changing, constantly being updated, constantly interacting with one another. Then, what happens to those patterns when the brain stops? Well, imagine a flame. There is fuel, oxygen, and the right conditions to sustain the chemical reaction. If you remove those conditions, the flame doesn't go it simply ceases to occur. And in a somewhat similar way, the patterns of activity in the brain appear to depend on the conditions that keep the brain alive and functioning. When those conditions are gone, the patterns are no longer maintained. But even that analogy has its limits, because a flame doesn't ask questions about its own existence. And this brings us to the most puzzling part of all, consciousness. The fact that there is an experience happening at all. You are not just processing information, you are aware of it. There is something it feels like to be you right now, listening, thinking, wondering. Where does that come from? We can trace signals in the brain, map regions responsible for different functions. How changes in the brain affect experience, but the leap from physical processes to subjective experience is still something we don't fully understand. The biggest open questions in science and philosophy. That what happens to consciousness after death? We're really asking something even more fundamental. What is consciousness in the first place? And what are the conditions required for it to exist? Consciousness depends entirely on the brain. Then it would seem that when the brain stops, consciousness stops as well. But if there's something more to it, something we haven't yet discovered or understood, then the picture might be incomplete. And this is where a careful way of thinking becomes important. It's easy to jump from we don't fully understand this to there must be something beyond what we can see. But those are not the same statement. Knowing is not the same as knowing something else is there. So a curious mind stays in that space of uncertainty. The urge to fill in the gaps too quickly. It keeps asking questions, keeps examining assumptions, keeps separating what we can observe from what we imagine. Because in the end, taking the question apart doesn't necessarily give us a final answer, but it does something just as valuable. It helps us see more clearly what we're really asking, what we actually know, and where the real mysteries still remain, waiting to be understood, waiting to be explored, waiting to be explored. It is the same kind of curiosity that made us ask in the first place. Because the truth is, the mystery of death isn't just about the end of life, about understanding what life is in the first place. You see, we tend to think of life as something obvious. You're either alive or you're not. There's a clear boundary, a clear distinction. But looking closely, really closely, that line becomes a lot less sharp than it first appears. Life, as it turns out, is not a simple switch that's either on or off. It's a continuous set of interactions happening at many different levels all at once. At the basic level, your body is made up of atoms, ordinary atoms, the same kind you'd find anywhere in the universe. There's nothing particularly special about them individually. Helium, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. These are not alive on their own, and yet, when arranged in an incredibly complex and specific way, they give rise to something that can move, think, feel, and wonder. Where exactly does life exist? Которое длится 100 лет, is it in the atoms themselves? Clearly not. Is it in the arrangement? That seems closer. But even that is not the full story, because the arrangement is constantly changing. The atoms in your body today are not all the same ones you had years ago.
The years are not all the same ones you had years ago.
Matter flows in and out, yet the pattern, the organization, persists. And that suggests something interesting. Life is less like a thing and more like a pattern that maintains itself over time. Then death might be understood as a loss of that pattern. Then dramatic, all at once a sense necessarily, but as a gradual breakdown of the processes that keep the pattern stable. Coordination between cells fails, the communication systems stop working, and the overall organization begins to fall apart. But even here, we have to be careful with our language. The pattern is lost, it sounds like it goes somewhere or disappears into some hidden place. But what we really mean is that it is no longer being sustained. Now that the accept are no longer present. And this brings us back to that idea of the self. We often think of ourselves as solid, continuous entities, as if there's a fixed you that exists independently of everything else. Look at it from this perspective, the self starts to look more like a process than a thing, a constantly updating pattern of thoughts, memories, sensations, and interactions with the world. Identity is not frozen. It changes over time. Your opinions shift, your memories evolve, your body changes, your experiences reshape how you see things. And yet there is still this sense of continuity, this feeling that all of these changes are happening to the same you. So what is that continuity? Is it the memory? Is it the structure of the brain? Is it the ongoing flow of experience? And when that flow stops, when the pictures stop generated, are no longer active, what happens to that sense of self? From a certain point of view, it may not be that the self goes anywhere out. The process we call the self is no longer recurring. Just like a whirlpool, and a river exists only as long as the water is moving in a certain way. The self may exist only as long as the underlying processes are active. That's the case. It doesn't make the experience of being alive any less remarkable. In fact, it makes it more so. Because now instead of thinking of life as something static, something dynamic, something constantly in motion, something that exists only because countless interactions are happening in just the right way. That raises another interesting question. If life and consciousness are processes, patterns that emerge from complexity, then how rare are they? Often does the universe arrange itself in such a way that something like a mind appears? And if it can happen once, could it happen again somewhere else under different conditions? The question of death expands beyond the individual. It becomes part of a much larger picture, a picture about how the universe works, how complexity arises. As simple as atoms can organize themselves into something that can ask questions about its own existence, something that can reflect, imagine, and wonder, that can look at the idea of its own ending and try to make sense of it, even as it continues to live, to think, and to search for understanding without ever quite reaching a final answer.